Hi, everyone, and happy Wednesday. I am so excited to be welcoming you all to this semester's episode of Art Up Close at the BCMA. This is our third semester of Art Up Close, and we're really happy to be back. So with that, I'm Lucy Siegel. I'm in my senior year at Bowdoin. I'm an art history and government double major, and I work as a curatorial assistant at the BCMA. And I'm really looking forward to today's presentation.
And I'm Sabrina Lin. I was Bowdoin College class of 2021, and I am now the curatorial assistant and manager of student programs at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. The museum is thrilled to be hosting Art Up Close today, and Art Up Close is aimed at connecting students with specific artworks in the museum's collections. Each episode features a bite-sized presentation led by a Bowdoin student, art history professor, or museum staff member. We hope you learned something new today, and we encourage you to ask questions in the chat after Professor Gulkis' presentation. Our episodes from last semester are posted on Bowdoin's YouTube channel, and I'll drop a link in the description for you to check this out.
All right, so without further ado, I am pleased to introduce visiting Professor Bronwyn Gulkis. Professor Gulkis is a specialist in the arts of South Asia and the Islamic world, with a specific focus on painting and calligraphy traditions associated with India's Mughal Empire, which reigned from 1526 to 1857. In addition to teaching topics about Asian art, Professor Gulkis has contributed to museum exhibits at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Harvard Art Museums, and Smithsonian National Museum of Asian Art, where she was awarded a predoctoral fellowship to research their collection of Mughal album folios. So Professor Gulkis' interests range from painting and illuminated manuscripts to architectural ornament and portable objects. And she'll be addressing these topics and more in her spring 22 classes at Bowdoin. These are the Arts of the Islamic Book and Art and Architecture in South Asia. So we encourage our virtual audience to engage with Professor Gulkis and ask any questions you can think of. And so with that, here's Professor Gulkis.
Today, I will be discussing some of the South Asian and Islamic collections at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. My research focuses on the art of the Mughal Empire, which controlled large portions of South Asia between the dynasty's founding in 1526 and their eventual dissolution under British rule in 1857. This time period in this region encompasses a huge variety of artistic production, and so I'm going to be looking at one aspect of Mughal painting that stood out to me in the Bowdoin collections, and that is the various approaches to portraiture in South Asia and what it can mean. These objects are one of the lesser-known collection areas at the museum, but they reveal a number of interesting connections with both the museum as an educational resource and with the broader history of New England collecting. I will be focusing on two objects today that speak to this history. The first is this drawing, which came to the museum in 1935 and was given the generic title of Figure on Horseback by an unknown Persian artist. However, there are many elements in how this figure is depicted that allow us to narrow it down. Both the rider and his horse are richly appointed. The man wears a flowing robe called a jama, which is secured with tassels under his right arm, and an impressive array of jewelry in the form of multiple necklaces, an armband with a huge jewel, and a turban draped with pearls and an elaborate plume. He also carries a quiver of arrows, a long spear, and a push dagger at his waistband, which is a weapon from India designed to be clenched in the wearer's fist and supported against the forearm. The artist has also hinted at the complex textile patterns in the rider's clothes and lingered over elements like the tassels hanging from the horse's saddle and its braided mane. And though the drawing is badly damaged here on the right side, we get the sense that the horse was wearing a decorated bridle of some sort. All these features together allow us to identify this image as Indian rather than Persian. More specifically, many of these details are symbols of state power associated with the Mughal emperors. These huge strands of pearls, for example, would have been strung with rubies and emeralds, which were reserved for the highest-ranking members of the Mughal royal family. We usually see them on emperors and princes' favorite sons. There are also allegorical images borrowed from European religious art, like the angels we see in the sky up above, and the halo around the rider's head, which in Mughal India became political symbols representing kingship. Looking more specifically at the figure's features, the man's distinctive pointed beard and strong jawline allow us to identify this drawing as a portrait of the 17th century Mughal emperor Shah Jahan, better known as the patron of the Taj Mahal. But the identification doesn't end there, because this drawing is actually a copy after a well-known equestrian portrait of Shah Jahan by the artist Payag, now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. This painting is much more fully realized, from the artist's use of color to the sensitivity of the drapery on the emperor's jama and the gleam of his weapons. Elements like how the emperor's expression seems wise and thoughtful instead of blank, like we see in the Bowdoin drawing, are one of the many clues that this is probably a later image based on an original masterpiece. But before we dismiss the Bowdoin drawing as an inferior copy, I would like to talk about the role these sort of drawings played in the Mughal workshop. Nowadays, we often think of making a copy as a bad thing, kind of like a form of cheating. But across much of art history, including in South Asia and the Islamic world, copying was a way of learning and also a way of transmitting information. Rulers like Shah Jahan didn't sit for a new portrait every time they wanted a new image created, but their artists created back catalogs of drawings and sketches and templates they could fill into order when a new project was commissioned. So even a work like Payag's portrait of Shah Jahan, which probably would have been recognized as a masterpiece in its own time, and we can tell by the handwriting in the margin, identifying the artists by name, and then also that the artist has signed his own work in minute handwriting at the tip of the emperor's bow. A work like this, as impressive as it is, both to its 17th century Mughal viewers and to us now, didn't stay as a singular work for long, but would have had artists copying it and recopying it as building blocks for new compositions. This process could also persist beyond the emperor's own lifetime, as we see in two later versions of the same image, one also in the Met collection, and another in the Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art. Art historians have identified both of these as 19th century copies, and usually talk about them in the context of fakes, intending to fool less discerning buyers who thought they were purchasing original Shah Jahani paintings. Stuart Cary Welch, who was responsible for popularizing the album many of these images belong to, described one painting thus: "Disinclined to make a precise copy, the painter began with a tracing of Payag's majestic portrait of Shah Jahan astride a favorite stallion, and then let his imagination ramble. Horse and rider face right rather than left, requiring that reins and lance change hands. The animal's markings are playfully different, and the flowered turf has been transformed into a riverside landscape with trees and palaces. Chitarman's refulgent depiction of Shah Jahan also inspired the pasticheur. Determined to improve the original, the artist enlarged all the jewels and brightened the colors. He hennaed the white yak tail hanging from the horse's neck and trimmed Shah Jahan's coat, pajamas, and saddlecloth with a green of ferocious hue." When we look back at the Bowdoin drawing, however, it is evident that the artist was working from some of these later versions by following the composition of a horse and rider facing right, set against a cityscape, and hinting at the clusters of greenery in the foreground and a deep space of rolling hills in the background. But there are also signs that the artist is trying to understand or study a source image. By working in some details of the emperor's floral trousers, and we see the sprigged floral decoration here, and also hinting at the color scheme of his clothes and the horse's livery. So, while this drawing is almost certainly later than the more better-known paintings based on this image, I would also like us to move away from the idea of calling it a copy and think of it more like a study after a painting from the Imperial Mughal workshop. And hopefully, through contemporary research, we'll be able to recognize more of these later Mughal paintings as studies and responses, rather than as fakes or copies as they would have once been understood. Like many South Asian works in the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, this drawing probably came to us via a European traveler in South Asia, whether directly or through an intermediary like a dealer. Over the course of the 19th century, when this drawing was probably made, portraits of Indian rulers became a subject of particular interest to European collectors. The demand for these images caused Indian artists to branch out into new types of copy. Sets of miniaturized portraits on ivory, like this one, often repeated the visual language of earlier portraits, such as the use of the figure in profile. These became popular souvenirs in the 19th century, and they still show up in antique stores and in museum collections built over the 19th and 20th centuries, including here in New England. For example, Boston collector Isabella Stewart Gardner visited India in the 1880s and owned this set of ivory portrait miniatures of Shah Jahan and his wife. These painted ivory discs could be made into jewelry or lapel pins or displayed in a purpose-built case, as with the Bowdoin set. This was a change from the earlier context of these portraits, which Mughal rulers were more likely to give as diplomatic gifts and expressions of political power. Instead, these sets of political and architectural imagery helped make South Asia knowable to Europeans, who often had only passing contact with local history and culture. So, on one hand, they are serving an almost educational purpose, and I hope that some Bowdoin students might be interested in tracking down the exact history of some of the figures labeled in this set of miniatures. At the same time, though, these images reduced historical and political figures to curiosities. We can also see that the style itself has changed. Instead of emphasizing a smooth, unbroken line like we saw in the drawing, the artists who worked on these miniatures used loose, shimmering brushstrokes of bright colors, creating an effect that is more like a European watercolor. However, if we compare these techniques with renditions of the Shah Jahan on horseback theme from the 19th century, we can see that elements like the palette, the relatively stiff outlines, and the use of small, luminous brushstrokes was a shared feature of 19th century Indian painting. So, again, instead of thinking of these late works as inferior copies, I encourage us to look at them as an example of how subject matter, technique, and media could all cross-pollinate at this period in Indian history. So, by examining these works of art in the Bowdoin collections, we can learn a lot, not just about the objects themselves, but the moment in history and art history when they were being produced. They also hint at some larger conversations about originality, collecting, or even knowledge circulation that we see across the South Asian collections at the museum. And I do hope that I have encouraged everyone to take a closer look at these objects and to see what the collection has to offer and to teach the Bowdoin community.
Wow, Professor Gulkis, thank you so much. That was wonderful, and I especially like the call to arms at the end for Bowdoin students to engage more specifically with that part of the collection. Yeah, and so we're now going to open the floor for questions from our audience. Please feel free to drop the questions in the chat and just ask any questions you can think of, and we'll go through and answer them in the order they come in. But to kick us off first, I'm wondering how this painting, the Bowdoin version, may have been viewed or displayed originally at the time it was made. Yeah, if you know anything about that.
Sure. And can everyone hear me okay? Great. So if we take a look at the paintings I was comparing the Bowdoin drawing with, and I think I can share my screen. So if we take a look at paintings like this, or even these later ones, we see they're surrounded by this really elaborate border. And that's because many of these paintings would have been bound into these collections known as albums, which were the main way that the Mughals circulated works of painting and calligraphy. And these borders were part of this elaborate mounting scheme that would have been coordinated across the whole volume. But in the case of drawings, especially later ones like this, and ones that are less of a virtuoso display of the artist's drawing skill, these probably would have been loose folios that would have been kept in sort of portfolios or as samples of the artist's work. And as I've tried to emphasize, the act of copying is really a learning process for artists in this period. And so this may have even been something that was intended for the artists to work from and to circulate among each other, rather than necessarily to present to a ruler or to a patron. This is long after Shah Jahan's lifetime. The Mughals are greatly diminished in power. It's unlikely they were showing this to anyone associated with the Mughal royal family, but it indicates that at some point, the artist making this drawing had seen some of these other images.
Great, thank you. And we already have a couple questions. Our first one is about, is there a standard set of these miniatures? Are they pre-chosen? If you know anything about that.
So is that referring to the ivory, the ivories showed at the end? And just also that's a great opening to the whole terminology of the idea of a miniature, that I refer to the ivories as miniatures, and I don't refer to these paintings of the drawings as a miniature, even though that's a term we sometimes see in older sources, because one of the things that these ivories are doing is sort of making all of these leaders and all of these architectural sites and political events kind of bite-sized, and it almost trivializes them. And the whole concept of them being miniatures you can wear on your lapel sort of shrinks everything down to size. And we try and avoid those sort of connotations when talking about these masterful paintings from the 17th century Mughal court. But in terms of the selection of miniatures that we see in these ivories, what's actually the most typical, it's not standardized, but you see a lot of these architectural images. And in that case, there were some of the more finely worked examples were actually these really, really tiny ivories that illustrated different buildings around Delhi. And those show up much more frequently across these different sets. And it's also showing portraits of Sikh rulers. And those are much more kind of rough quality. They all have this really exaggerated profile where it almost looks like their chin is like melting into their neck. That's not very closely observed from nature. But you rarely see these ivory portraits of Sikh rulers, for instance, and that can be tied to a specific battle, a specific Anglo-Sikh war that took place in the 1840s. And so it's both standardized across the type of figures you usually see, but the Bowdoin set is unique in some ways too.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. We have another question about the dealers, a couple questions about the dealers actually. So first, were there dealers in the 18th and 19th century in Europe who sold Indian works, and was there a vogue in collecting Indian work there? And then finally, when did Indian artworks begin to be collected in the United States? So it's a bit of a three-parter, and I can go back to the other parts at any point, but the first one's about 18th and 19th century dealing in Europe.
So there were dealers who were working at this point, and we can even trace through sort of contextual evidence, can trace the movement of Indian paintings and drawings to Europe much, much earlier. So the European artist Rembrandt, famous name in history of Western art, has copies he made after Mughal paintings and drawings of Shah Jahan and his sons, for instance. And so we know that he actually had a small collection of Mughal paintings that would have been in transit to Europe. Rembrandt never visited India, of course, but he is located in a place that was an incredible center for trade and exchange. And so we can reconstruct some of that process, and also through the travel of different European political agents, ambassadors, merchants, and things in South Asia. But art dealing as a sort of profession really takes off in the 19th and the early 20th century. And that's when we get this explosion of a lot of dealers who haven't really been working directly with Indian artists or Indian courts, obtaining these collections. And that's also because the Mughal Empire, as it sort of starts to crumble, and there also starts to be many more Europeans coming into India and working in this British Empire apparatus, East India Company apparatus, that they're also bringing things back, and rather than selling them in India, they might just bring them to a dealer in London or in Paris or in Switzerland. And so that's part of that process. And this is a whole area of research that art historians are looking into. And so there's a lot of different strands to tease apart. But as for the question of whether there was a vogue for collecting Indian art, there were certainly sort of moments when it became more popular, and a lot of that can be tied to information about different British agents working in South Asia. But there's not an equivalent to something like Japonism, when Japanese woodblock prints come into European markets and are sort of cheap and available and inspire all these Western artists start working with new compositions and new sort of modes of representation. There's not a sort of Indian moment in the same way, though there are certain artists who are sometimes inspired by these more than others. And I think there was a third part to that question, was that when Indian art started being collected?
Yes, in the United States, though, specifically, if that ever made it across the pond, yeah.
So the sort of formal collection of Indian art is usually traced back to the work of Ananda Coomaraswamy at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, who was their first curator of South Asian and Islamic art. And he himself was Anglo-Sri Lankan. He had a large sort of personal collection that he had acquired, and was working very much in this international mode of working with modernist artists and dancers and musicians, sort of interested in popularizing the Indian spirit to a Western audience. And this is part of a larger conversation about things like the popularization of Indian philosophy in the West, and the rise of techniques like yoga being popular in the West. And so that is usually thought of as the beginning of collecting Indian art as a sort of deliberate act. But we can tell from the Bowdoin collections that some of this is being collected a lot earlier. Some of the objects in the Bowdoin collection we can trace to the 1880s or 1890s. And like the Isabella Stewart Gardner collection, we can tell that this is more out of a spirit of eclecticism, of these wealthy sort of world travelers who are interested in a little bit of everything. They might do a grand tour of Europe, and then if they really have the resources to do a tour of British India at this point, they might also go to Delhi and to the Taj Mahal in Agra and hit up these different sites and sort of acquire curiosities on the way. So that's another way that these ivory portrait miniatures can sort of be viewed, that in the Gardner Museum, for instance, in context, they're alongside some other sort of like tourist art almost that is very similar to what we see in South Asia today, or even in sort of antique shops today of sort of wrought metal little jewelry boxes, carved wood, sort of pieces of jewelry. Sometimes it's like brass. And so this is a very different collecting circuit than what something like Kumaraswamy will be doing a few decades later, of trying to bring in masterpieces and really shape a history of the field as worthy of study in the same way that Western art is.
All right, thank you for that. And we have a couple more questions, but only time for one. So I'm gonna ask this last question about another question about the ivory miniatures. So would the court artists of these miniatures have been in a high status social position, or was their social role more like a craftsperson?
And so the artists who are working on the ivory miniatures, we know a lot less about them than we do about the artists who are working under the so-called the Great Mughals in the 17th century. But based on art historical comparison, so I brought up one of the details of this real sort of use of these shimmering like watercolor brushstrokes, where you get a sense of different color washes over the figures' faces. This is showing up in these ivory portrait miniatures that, you know, sometimes they're better than others, sometimes it's not totally successful, like some of those Sikh general faces. But we see the same techniques showing up in late Mughal paintings that are being made, even as the empire is sort of falling apart, that they still have these different core groups of artists who are working. Sometimes they do work for the Mughal emperors, even though the Mughal emperors are controlling an area like the size of Brunswick at this point. They don't have a lot of power, but they're still commissioning portraits and art because that's part of what you do. And then they also will pivot and start making things for Europeans who are based in Delhi, or they might pivot and move to another regional capital that are actually more powerful at this point and create something for these sort of regional lords who are affiliated with the Mughals. And so we see a lot more mobility of artists moving between places. But in terms of their sort of social role, they're playing both sides. That on one hand, they are actually working with the objects directly, and so that's sort of more similar to a craftsperson. And over time in South Asian art history, there are a lot of connections between different craft castes, such as people who are carpenters by profession, for instance, sometimes will transition into painting. And the idea that it's both an extension of working with your hands, as opposed to something like calligraphy, that's like a very cerebral, sort of highbrow art form. But in terms of their social role at this point, we know a lot more about them as intermediaries than as necessarily the type of relationships they had one-on-one. There's a few indications that they were the ones doing some of this collecting, though, in terms of bringing these albums of later paintings together and sort of interspersing them with these amazing 17th century pieces and sort of making some of those connections. So that's another reason why I think we should look at these 18th and 19th century examples as part of a legacy, because there's evidence that the artists themselves saw it in that light.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for your answers, for your presentation. Yeah, and I will not get to take class with you before I graduate. So I am so grateful that I had this experience with you, and I hope our audience feels similarly. This was really great. Thank you so much, Professor Gulkis, and thank you to our audience.
And I encourage anyone to take a look at the collections in the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. These Indian objects are really understudied, but they have so much to tell us. And I would be happy to see anyone who's present today in any of my classes in the spring and to learn more about the context and history of how these paintings were created.
Thank you so much, Professor Gulkis' presentation, and thank you everyone for joining us at our 10th episode of Art Up Close. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.